Warning: the podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast, the Overdose Murder of Bobbie Jean Blacka miniseries. Episode 1 of 4.
Wendy, do you want to tell the listeners what they're in store for with this mini-series that we're releasing today?
Yeah, this is a very different death investigation than we typically do. This is an overdose death that occurred in 2014 in West Virginia with a young lady by the name of Bobbie Jean Blacka. And we have with us Officer Bobby McKone that worked this case.
Exactly. It's very unique because it comes down to that philosophical and legal question. Can you charge a drug dealer or a drug provider with murder or another charge that makes them responsible for somebody's death? And you're right, Bobby McKone is going to be our guest, and he has since retired from law enforcement, is in the professional banking industry now. But what we're going to see in this miniseries, which, by the way, I love the miniseries, and I think the fans do too, because they release every week instead of every other week. If we're in 4 episodes, I want them to be able to stay current with it. But for example, in the episode 1 that we're about to listen to today is we're going to get to know a lot about Bobbie Jean and the tragic loss of her life, what she was dealing with in her life, a little bit of her family. We'll start talking a little bit about the case, but one thing that I like about this is that I think people picked up on so far is these shows are not scripted. We work with sort of an outline, but they're not scripted. So we end up having the opportunity to have these very good organic conversations with the presenters, and that happened with Bobbie in this case. We started talking about the case, got a summary of it out, and then Bobbie went into a fantastic conversation in episode 1 about drug addiction, some of the science behind it, some of the treatments available behind it, specifically what first responders can do as far as, for example, Narcan administration and what was available in 2014 and what's available now, even to the point where people's family members and people that are struggling with addiction now can actually obtain Narcan in case they have an overdose. So I think it's going to be very unique. It's different, like you said. We're going to leave it to the listeners to listen to all the episodes to find out what happened to this case and did people get held responsible for it.
Okay, well, with that being said, let's dig right on into episode 1.
Okay, let's go. Well, good afternoon, Bobbie. Thanks for coming and doing the show, and at least we're not coming, but doing it remotely. I'm really excited about this whole topic, and it's a very difficult topic, but at the same time, I think that the listeners are going to learn a whole lot about this specific type of death investigation and how it relates to the criminal justice system. But let's start, first of all, with telling the listeners your name and go into your background on what you've done for a living to bring you to this point.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you having me on the show, Dave. I'm really looking forward to doing an overview with this case. Hello, everyone. My name is Bobby McKone. I have a 14-year law enforcement background. I've kind of done a little bit of everything, starting off in a correctional setting for a sheriff's office. I was a correctional deputy and intake officer for 6 years. Did that for a while and kind of really wasn't feeling correction. I always had a passion to get out on the road and do investigations and be a patrol officer. Left the correctional setting in Western Maryland, a little county called Allegheny County, Maryland. Went to the West Virginia State Police Academy, graduated there, became a patrol corporal, worked there for about 5 or 6 years, and then I moved to North Carolina, became a criminal gang investigations detective down here in North Carolina, a beautiful town called New Bern in Craven County. And since then, I've kind of transitioned outside of law enforcement. In 2018, I went into the corporate banking realm, into the investigations of financial crime. So we have our Bank Secrecy Act program, our anti-money laundering, terroristic financing, fraud, various forms of financial crime. And I kind of do that now as a training coordinator. But throughout the course of my career, I've been very blessed that I've had a chance to be exposed to a lot of different components and different inner workings of the law enforcement profession. I've been an instructor, I've been a field training commander, investigator, detective, and then, like I said, I have that corrections element as well. So I have seen a good bit throughout 14 years that I've done this, and I'm very happy to share some of that experience on the show today.
If I can walk back a little bit on your corrections, because that's a a very unique part of our justice system and a very unique career. When you were doing corrections, is there anything you learned from that environment that helped you later in your career?
Absolutely. I can tell you in a jail setting or corrections, there's different type of correctional systems. So if you go into a prison or go into a jail, it might be direct or indirect supervision is what it's referred to. And what that means is indirect supervision. You may be up in a tower or a bubble or a closed office where you're not really mingling and interacting with the inmates a bunch. You may be required to go out and do what's called a tier walk, where once an hour you kind of leave that tower or leave that bubble and you kind of go and walk around the pod and make sure everything's okay, everybody's safe, and you get a chance to interact. But that's usually done fairly fast, and then you go right back up into your tower, your bubble, your office, your pod. With indirect supervision or direct supervision, the one that I did, literally you walked into a housing unit and sat right in the middle of the unit, and you hit the group release button, and then 50, 60 doors flung open and 100 inmates surrounded you, and you were right in the middle of them. So in that type of environment, I really had to learn how to address the inmates with respect. I had to get on their level. I had to network with them. I had to build, I don't want to say camaraderie. I don't want to use that word because there was that clear separation of, hey, I'm a correctional officer and you're an inmate. There was that very clear line, but I did have to develop some type of positive rapport with those inmates, because obviously they outnumbered me 100 to 1 on any given day. And I think following that into my experience as a patrol officer, learning how to come at criminals or people that I arrested and treat them with integrity and respect and develop that rapport with them, I've been able to have cases later on where they've given me confessions, full, 3-page handwritten confessions, because they trusted me and they knew that I was going to do fair by them. I've had hostage situations where they've called out to the hostage negotiator and said, hey, bring, Corporal McKone out here. He's the only one that I'll turn myself into. I'll lower my weapon and I'll come talk to him because he's always treated me fairly. So I think if I had to give one takeaway from the correctional setting, and obviously I believe there's many throughout my 6-year career, I think I would pinpoint that one is the most important.
And thanks for sharing that, because in my career, especially later in my career when I was more involved with the backgrounds piece on who we were hiring, it was my experience that the people that we took from a corrections background, to me, their communication skills were much better right off the bat because of that. I used to joke that all I had to do was live with them for 20 or 30 minutes on the ride to the facility, but the people inside had to live with them. And it's a neat thing to hear, too, because you get a lot of people that don't understand how important that is to treat people properly. You'll get the people that they'll say, well, they're in prison. They shouldn't have air conditioning. They don't need cable TV. And it's so much more complex than that. And in the end, too, is that it's just the right thing to do. So thanks for sharing that.
It truly is. And I think the thing is, I kind of had that mindset whenever I went into the prison system as well. Granted, at that time I was 23 years old, and I don't think that I had developed emotionally to the state that I am now at almost 40 years old. But at 23 years old, walking a maximum security tier at Roxbury Correctional Institute in Western Maryland, I kind of had that same thought process. But I think the reasoning behind it is if you keep the inmates, obviously at any point in time, they can riot, they can tear down the jail if they want to. You might have 3,000 inmates in a prison setting and only 60 or 80 officers on shift. So I think that's the part of just getting that happy medium, that we'll show you respect, you show us respect. Let's get through the day. We don't want anybody to get hurt, inmate or officer. And it's part of that, creating a happy atmosphere where everybody can just coincide and get through the day without any injury or any problems.
That's the go. And again, more power to you when you get that relationship with people later that appreciate being treated like way. Mm-hmm. That's amazing stuff. Well, is there anything else in your career path that you want to talk about before we move on? Any other experiences or anything? Because I kind of jumped in with that question, and I hope I didn't interrupt your train of thought.
No, absolutely. I think throughout, I talked about my time as an instructor. I absolutely love getting a chance to network and work with people, in a teaching capacity, because any good instructor will tell you, you're not only teaching the student, but, if you don't take something away from the student at every single training session you do, you're probably not listening. I can honestly say that any of my students have taught me stuff a lot over the years, that they've come up after class or on break and let me share something with you, or can I talk to you? And you also learn from the student. So I think the training aspect of it has been huge for me. It truly is my passion. But then later on in life and later in my career, I really developed a passion for leadership and leadership development, conceptual leadership. And that's actually how I'll let the viewers know, that's how Dave and I actually met, was at FBI LEADA, Law Enforcement Executive Leadership Development Association, and leadership classes. Those classes are fantastic. I would encourage any law enforcement officer officer that's currently on the call right now that has that ability that their agency will sponsor and endorse them to go. We've also had students in the class that have been private pay. They've paid for the training themselves and arranged their own transportation, paid for their own hotel. I paid for the courses myself out of my own pocket. Luckily, I did have sponsorship to pay for my hotels and my travel, but I paid the fee, the registration fee, and it was worth every single penny. And that is something in my career, finding out at the last stages of my 14-year career, that I wish I could have gone back and done from year number 2 or year number 3, because I look back on a lot of mistakes that I made, and I know I would have done things differently if I had that leadership training in my back pocket to rely on.
Well, thanks for the plug, for sure. I know that
Right.
I enjoy it. Like we were talking before we started recording, is that one of the things I enjoy the most about it is just the people I meet all across the country. And I'm with you, is that in my career, all the way up to that final 5, maybe 6 years on the command staff, is that leadership is such an important part of what policing is. And maybe we'll do a show on some of that at some point, because I think the people in the public that aren't really involved may not appreciate how important that leadership is to set the paradigm for an organization and all the people connecting with people. But
Right. I absolutely love it now. It's my second greatest passion, I would say, next to training, which they kind of go hand in hand, but I would love to be a part of that. I'd like to come back and do a leadership segment with you.
Oh yeah, we might have to talk about that, because I think people would be fascinated by that, because it's unseen. It is really unseen. Well, I'll tell you what, this is a very unique type of case. We haven't covered this before, and but I can see that we probably might cover more of it in the future. But give the listeners an idea of where you're going to go with this and the concept of what this case is about.
Okay, absolutely. So we're going to kind of do a high-level overview of a heroin-related overdose death investigation that I worked in 2014. At the early stages of this investigation, we had only had, I believe it was one case that was on the West Virginia United States Supreme Court docket that had set precedents for this case. And when I say it set precedents, what it means is it was able to give law enforcement officers the ability to charge an individual who brought narcotics to a house, who gave somebody heroin, and it resulted in their death. If that drug dealer, that drug pusher, she delivered narcotics, and it resulted in a death, it gave law enforcement the ability to criminally charge under murder. So it was very much a challenge for us, and I'm going to talk a lot about, the challenges in court, the challenge of charging and doing the investigation. But in a nutshell, that's kind of where we're going to go with this.
Fascinating. And I really think people need to listen to this, because it's easy to assume. A lot of people, again, kind of like with corrections, is the assumptions they make. But it's easy to assume that, well, that person's responsible for a death, but it's much more complicated than that. This is an epidemic that is taking way too many lives and destroying too many lives. And I'm a big believer in that accountability end of that too.
Absolutely.
When we're talking about this case, what can you tell me about the victim in this case? That anything about this person that died as a result of this overdose?
Yeah. So my victim, her name is Bobbie Jean Blacka. She's a 38-year-old white female. She did have 2 children. When I spoke with her mother about this case, she kind of alluded to the fact that she was married. I don't know if it was a legal marriage or if it was one of those things where they were in a domestic partnership, cohabitating together, and she kind of just referred to the father of her children as being her husband. So I don't know if she was lawfully married to this individual, but her mother identified her as being married and having 2 kids. She did have a narcotics abuse problem in the past. And then her mom said that she got clean for a very long time, started to go through some depression, some anxiety issues, was on the verge of going through a divorce, had some marital problems or some issues with her significant other, the father of her children. And her mother speculated that that's the whole reason that, we would have been called to this scene, because she got back into narcotics after quite some time of being sober and being clean. And then, I don't know if the listeners are aware, but a lot of times whenever you have somebody that's addicted to opium, opiates, heroin, if they go clean for a while and they get clean and they kind of detox, a lot of times we'll see it in the jail system. They'll come into the jail system and be clean for 6 months, 7 months. And as soon as they get released from jail, their first goal is to go out and find their dealer and get that hit of heroin. And they usually either use too much or they're using the same level that they've developed a tolerance to, and it results to them having an overdose. And that's kind of what her mom was alluding to. She was a heroin user before, but she got clean. And her mom just kind of speculated to, maybe she was going through some stuff and she went back and tried to shoot that same dosage, that she was used to. And it's what killed her. She just couldn't take it. And then, of course, at that time, we started to see the huge surge of fentanyl, the opium being cut and laced with fentanyl and harder narcotics. They were mixing it and cutting it, which, if a person was used to shooting a half a gram of heroin and obtaining that same high, that half gram of heroin would be significantly stronger because of being chased and cut with other narcotics.
Is the fentanyl something that was rather new on the forefront of drug abuse as far as being cut with fentanyl? Was that?
It was very much in our area at that time. We had only heard about it for a couple months, and obviously because, I'll go into it a little bit more, but we did not recover any narcotics at the scene, so we weren't able to do a lab test and see if it in fact did have fentanyl in it. So I'll talk a little bit more about that with evidentiary collection and evidentiary discovery piece that we go into.
Well, Bobby, we're ready to go, but I do have to tell the listeners that Wendy just walked in and got home. She was going to be here a few minutes before we started recording, and for my local listeners, she got stuck on Nicholasville Road, and I'm sure they understand the pain of Nicholasville Road. That's our probably biggest choke point in town. So, Wendy, meet Bobby, and Bobby, meet Wendy.
Nice to meet you, Bobby.
Nice to meet you as well, Wendy.
Thank you for doing this show with us. I'm very excited to hear about this case. I will be honest, I've not gotten time to proof a lot of your notes here that you've given to us. So why don't you dive right in and just tell us how you got involved in this, what you were doing when the call came out, and then we'll just lead right on into the case itself.
Sure, absolutely. So kind of just to give the listeners a little bit of background of my jurisdiction, the area that this stuff took place, this case happened in. The Center for Disease Control in 2018 released statistics that said that West Virginia had the highest heroin-related mortality rate in the entire country. And those numbers have not let up. They've continued to increase. So West Virginia as a single state, we could be talking about downtown Los Angeles, we could be talking about Miami-Dade, Florida, and it's actually West Virginia that has the highest problem with heroin-related deaths in the entire country. Netflix actually did a documentary in 2017, and the documentary was actually titled Heroin. They could have picked anywhere in the country to go. They actually went to Huntington, West Virginia. So if the listeners are interested in watching that documentary, I believe it's only about 40 minutes or so. It's a really good documentary. It talks about how they're holding drug court and how they have advocacy programs and what they're doing to kind of get a hold on the epidemic in Huntington, West Virginia. It talks a little bit about the judicial system and the paramedics and the rollout of a drug that kind of has the adverse effect on heroin. A lot of times you'll hear me throughout the presentation refer to it as naloxone or Narcan. That is a drug that EMTs and now police officers are able to give people who are suffering from a heroin-related overdose that counteracts those drug effects. And we'll talk a little bit more about the physiology of the narcotic and kind of some of the adverse effects a little bit further into the case. My jurisdiction in and of itself, if you look at a map of West Virginia, my jurisdiction was in a tiny county called Mineral County in Keyser, Keyser. That was the county seat of the jurisdiction. And I was a municipal police officer there. It's right on the eastern panhandle, so we border Maryland. And I'm talking, when I say border, it's like 10 minutes and you're across the Potomac River and you're into Maryland. We also were an hour away from Virginia, about 45 minutes away from Pennsylvania, 2 or 3 hours away from Ohio. So for us, it was very common for our local drug dealers to travel to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or to Baltimore, Maryland, and they would pick up heroin there because it was a lot cheaper to get in the city than what it was in West Virginia, where it was hard to come by. It was very rare because we're kind of buried in the mountains. We didn't have access to a lot of interstates, and they would have to drive quite a ways, but they would go there, which at the time, a lot of my interviews and interrogations that I've done from the undercover narcotics work that I did in my jurisdiction, they told me at the time in 2014, they could go to Baltimore, Maryland and pick up a half a gram or a gram of heroin for $15, depending on who the dealer was, and bring it back and double their profit and sell it for $30 in West Virginia because it was so hard to come by and it was hard to get. And then they would chop it up and they would lace it with other stuff and even mix it with some type of a household cleaner. Sometimes they might mix it with baking soda just to cut it and make their product go a lot further. If you have a gram of heroin and you dump a gram of baking soda in it, you've now doubled your product. But the people are then shooting baking soda or Arm & Hammer or whatever it is into their veins that's mixed with the drug itself. So because we were so close to that area, that was the challenge for us, is that people were going out of town left and right and buying this narcotics in bigger cities, and they were bringing it back to our jurisdiction where people were overdosing all the time. This was a time, again, being 2014, that law enforcement nor EMS actually carried Narcan or naloxone, that life-saving drug that we've talked a lot about. Now, you can get it over the counter in drugstores as an intramuscular injection, kind of like if people are familiar with EpiPens that you get for bee stings or allergic reactions, you can get the naloxone or the Narcan in an IM. So somebody who knows that they have an addiction to heroin, a lot of times when I've been to a heroin overdose, I've had their friends say, hey, I stuck that, that muscle injection into their leg when I knew they were having overdose symptoms, and we bought it at CVS pharmacy or Walgreens in case one of us had an overdose. So drug users have been carrying those in their vehicle and have been carrying those on their person in case one of them slipped into an overdose, because obviously they don't want to call the cops. And with that being said, a lot of legislators in various states, I know here in North Carolina, we have a law that's on the books that says that if someone calls law enforcement as a result to save someone's life from a heroin overdose, as long as they have under a certain amount of heroin at the scene, we cannot criminally charge anybody. They put that law on the books to try to have people feel more comfortable about calling for help whenever they need it and they're experiencing the signs and symptoms of an overdose, and not so fearful that if we call the ambulance, the cops are coming and one of us are going to get locked up. Because in that instance, a lot of times people just die and they flee the scene with the drugs because they're afraid of arrest. So we do have laws like that in the books in North Carolina since I became an officer down here. West Virginia, I honestly don't know if they've put those on the books. I haven't been a law enforcement officer there in 5 years, so I'm not sure if that's a law that West Virginia has also developed.
I do know we have something similar to that in Kentucky, and I think it's been pretty helpful in getting people, because the whole thing at that moment is getting aid for that person.
Right.
And just like you, we have Narcan available over the counter. Our officers, when I left, were actually using one that was administered nasally. So it had a nebulizer, and you would just push it, and sometimes people might need a couple doses of it. And I think I'm not going to steal the show, but you're going to talk about, when you're talking about cutting heroin with things like baking soda, there's other things that get added that have compounded this issue dramatically on saving lives with that. But good laws. And we do have those in Kentucky, and we do have that availability of the Narcan pretty easily here as well.
Absolutely.
But then you have to wonder how many users out there know of that law. Is that something that's commonly known that I can call without risking getting arrested? Do they know the amount, or do they just maybe don't know the law, so they do what most people do, and that's leave their friend or loved one there so that they're not arrested?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I do know that, again, I haven't been a law enforcement officer in North Carolina in 2 years since entering the banking private sector. But I know that whenever I left, that was something we were looking at doing with the Craven County Substance Abuse Coalition that we had formed. And that comprised of mental health professionals, local physicians, treatment centers, psychologists, police officers. We had everybody that was on board with this group, and it was a great cause, a really good, productive networking group. And that was something we were looking at doing. How do we get that literature out to individuals that may be struggling with substance abuse? I mean, that's something we can certainly give them pamphlets and advise them of the new legislative changes, if they come into the hospital or do things like that. But I know that's something they were working on, but I can't speak to the progress of it. But I know that that's something that we had considered as well.
It's got to be tough, because you're in the middle of a criminal element, and everybody's mindset is based on that. So that's a good question Wendy had, I think, is that we probably have a lot of people that, even if they've heard of it, they probably don't trust it. And that's understandable, because of the law is going to come through the door.
Well, certainly. Or you think that if they come in, are they going to measure, and are you slightly over and you're going to be arrested? So I would think for them, it's just easier to not follow that rule and risk getting caught.
I think a good balance to that is when they made Narcan available over the counter.
Right.
Is that I know that we had people that would consider having the old term a wingman or a wing woman, is that somebody would be with them, and there was an agreement that if they slipped deep into unconsciousness, is that somebody would hit them and make that call. So that was a good trade-off too, to kind of cover that base.
But it goes to show you what a stronghold these drugs have on people, to prepare ahead of time that you're going to get Narcan, or your friend's going to have it for you in case you OD, but you still continue to use, because that drug has such a hold on you that you're willing to risk overdosing and having the Narcan and probably hopefully coming back, but maybe not, but you still do it anyway. And that's always broken my heart that people can't break free from that. But I guess that's the danger of entering this lifestyle and these drugs.
Yeah, and just to play off of what Dave said, in our jurisdiction, I was actually a Narcan administration instructor. I also taught CPR and first aid and AED through the American Heart Association. So we were able to get a program together with our medical director, our local county medical director, and he said as long as you have CPR every single year and you go back and you do Narcan training every single year, you include any type of medication changes, anything that comes out from the board of directors for the medical side of the house, you cover anything that the law says and do your legal update, I will give you my blessing as the medical director to be able to administer Narcan or naloxone in your county. And all of our officers were also carrying the nasally administered version of the Narcan as well. And we launched that program probably a year and a half before I left the police department, and I was the agency's Narcan instructor. And we also covered that with bloodborne pathogens, and you had to go through a series of trainings, and we had to do it every single year annually. But we found that a lot of times with your canines, they would be doing a sniff on a car and going around and smelling around a car, or they would smell someone's bag, and your canine might get exposed to heroin. We had 2 officers, one of them opened up a purse, and the heroin was loose in the purse, and it threw a heroin mist up in his face with powdered brown heroin, and our officer started to feel the side effects of having an overdose, and we had to Narcan him. So I would encourage any law enforcement officer, if you're listening to this, your agency, your jurisdiction doesn't have this program, feel free to reach out to Dave. You can get in contact with me on LinkedIn. Dave can give you my contact information. I'd be more than happy to sit down and work with you and network on how you can develop that Narcan program for your agency if you're a smaller agency that has limited state funding.
So, Bobbie, I was wondering, approximately, you don't have to give exact, but approximately how many times when you got certified throughout your career before you transferred to a new agency did you issue that Narcan yourself?
So in West Virginia, we did not have Narcan available to us as law enforcement officers. And right before I left, because of the growing problem in West Virginia, our local paramedics were issued a form of Narcan that they could do. They could administer intravenous through an IV. So when I was in West Virginia, I had been to a lot of heroin overdoses, but I did not have the tools to administer Narcan then. In North Carolina, personally, myself as an instructor, I taught it every year, but administering it in the field, I think at least 6 or 7 times.
Were those successful bringbacks on those persons or not always?
They were every single time. So what basically happens is when you look at an opiate-based compound, it's referred to as a narcotic analgesic because the whole primary purpose of it is to be a painkiller. It's a pain reliever. So when you look at like your Percocets, your oxycodines, your Oxycontins, even Tylenol is a narcotic analgesic, ibuprofen, all of those things because it's a pain reliever, painkiller. If it's an opiate-based compound, what happens is a lot of people are typically confused and think, oh, they quote unquote, I'm using air quotes virtually now, quote unquote, they kind of stroke out or their heart stops, their heart explodes. I've heard all types of variations on what the lay person believes heroin does and the cause of death. But when you look at it, really what it is you almost slip into a lethargic, like a really sleepy state. It relaxes everything into your body. And what happens is the involuntary muscle and involuntary action in your brain that's telling you to take a breath stops. Because those opiate receptors actually go around the particles in the brain and it blocks that ability and you lose all control even to breathe on your own voluntarily. So they actually end up stop breathing and the cause of death is lack of oxygen. It's called hypoxia, low oxygen intake. When you shoot the Narcan, the naloxone up their nose, you have thin skin capillaries that are in your nose that absorb the chemical, the Narcan, the naloxone, and that has the counter effect on that. It takes those opium particles that are attacking your brain and telling you to go to sleep and to stop breathing, and it blocks those from recepting into the brain. And that's what lets the person come back out of it is they all of a sudden, they're not feeling that high. They're not feeling that adverse effect of the opium. So that's kind of the whole pretense behind it. Now, opiates can stay into the person's system actively for 72 hours. Narcan is only good for 12 hours. So a lot of officers that are on the call that are like, man, I've been out there and Narcaned somebody and they went back out there and used again, 4 or 5 hours later or the next day, and I had to go Narcan them again. If that person tells you, I promise I did not take any more heroin, they very well could be telling the truth because that drug is in their system for 72 hours and your Narcan wore off after 12 hours. I've had officers come back and tell me that person's a liar. They told me that they didn't use any more dope. Then why are we out there shooting them with Narcan again? And I had to explain that to them. So obviously it's something that we implemented into our training material to educate officers that very well could be a possibility that Narcan wears off and they start experiencing those overdose symptoms again and may not have used a second dose of heroin.
And that's good to know because a lot of people will refuse to go to the hospital. Is that again, you'll hit them with a Narcan, they'll come to, And usually by then your emergency medical service provider's there, and a lot of times they'll just refuse because they're out of it. And and that's why you end up getting a call later. That's a good point because a lot of people don't understand.
Right.
that.
No, I wouldn't have thought that either. I would have just assumed that they were being dishonest. Now, I was going to ask, you said that the paramedics were handling that intravenous Narcan. About how many ODs were you all seeing, let's just say in a week in Huntington?
And so, and Huntington's really, really bad. That's Cabell County, West Virginia. There's a lot of heroin there. In my town in West Virginia, we still saw it a lot. In a given week, I would go to 3 overdoses myself, and that was just on one shift. I was a day shift officer, and we worked 12-hour shifts. So some weeks I would work 3 days, and then some weeks I would work 4. In that 3 or 4 days, I would probably go to at least 3 overdoses.
Wow. Repeat
so
people?
Averaging 1 or 2 a day. And they typically were the same people that we identified in our community as having a heroin addiction problem. We went out there very frequently. I've had them come out of their heroin-induced state, and I've had them be combative because, number one, it causes confusion. If you slip into a high after you just shot heroin, and next thing you know, you're sound asleep, and then you wake up and you have 5 EMTs and 2 police officers standing over top of you, I'm sure that's a very disorienting experience. So I've had them not only be disoriented, but I've had them been furious with me because they may have stolen something, they may have done crazy things to get that dose of heroin, and I ruined their high for them. I've had them be very upset for that reason. And then, like Dave said, whenever they experience the adverse effect of the Narcan, they automatically think, I'm good. I don't feel like I'm high at all. I'm not feeling it. I'm going to do a signed care for refusal form with EMS, and I'm not going to the hospital because there's nothing I need. I'm good. And then, once they sign that refusal and they go back into the house a couple hours later, they may get that overdose symptoms again.
It's so very dangerous.
So, Bobbie, referencing back to May 8th, 2014, our victim, Bobbie Jean Blacka, age 38, why don't you tell us about when that call came out, how you were assigned that call, or what happened that led you to Bobbie Jean? Hey, you know there's more to the story, so go download the next episode like the true crime fan that you are.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, which is our website, and it has show notes for imagery and audio and video files related to the cases you're going to hear. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn, and YouTube, which has closed caption available for those that are hearing impaired. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you download your podcast from. Subscribe to the Murder Police Podcast and set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.